What's going on, guys? Welcome back to DCS World, and welcome to the first of a tutorial series that I'm beginning here for the A-10C Warthog. This is going to be a bit of an experiment for me as I attempt to accurately convey and essentially teach how to fly this aircraft. It's going to be mostly to see if I can do it, and hopefully it'll be of help to someone out there, mostly some of my friends who are learning this aircraft, but we will see how it goes. I'd like to begin with a little bit of history. The A-10 Thunderbolt II by Fairchild Republic first flew in 1970, and it entered service roughly the late 70s, I believe 1977 or so, and has been in service with the United States Air Force ever since through some various iterations. It is the premier close air support platform for the United States military. There is basically no other plane in the fleet that does what the A-10 can do as well as the A-10 can do it. You've got some multi-role aircrafts like the F-18 Hornet, the newer F-35 Lightning that are coming around that can fulfill all of these roles, but they're still nothing like the A-10C. It can carry so much ordnance, so many missiles, bombs, targeting computers, targeting pods, etc. And of course, we can't forget that big, beefy GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannon, as you can see on the nose of the airplane right over there. So, you know, like I was saying, a lot of history with this plane. It's been in service for quite some time, and with upgrades and other various improvements, it's slated to be in service till probably as far out as the year 2040. I mean, they are keeping these things in the air. They haven't built any new ones since the early 80s or so, but the existing airplanes have been receiving upgrades, repairs, improvements. In some cases, they're replacing the whole wings, rebuilding the airplanes, etc., keeping them in the air because the A-10 is just so good at what it does, and it's worth it to keep it around. But enough about the history. Let's jump into the cockpit. So here we are in the cockpit. Let me just get my camera controls going here so we can look around. I'd like to start with a bit of a cockpit tour. If you've never seen this airplane before, it can look quite daunting. I know it looked pretty daunting to me when I first started flying this thing, but I assure you it's not too bad once you get the hang of it. We're going to start over here on the left-hand side and just kind of go over what some of these panels are. We're not going to go into really in-depth on any of them in this video. This is just to give you a sort of a tour of the cockpit. So towards the back here we have the ground safe switches. This panel here does some functions that I'm not sure are actually implemented, but those switches all work. We have here an audio control panel. You'll generally not touch this too much, but it is there and can do some various things with intercom audio and some extra functionality. We have some emergency switches here for flap deployment, flap retraction, flight control, emergency switches and systems, secondary trim controls, things of that nature. If we go right next to it, right about here, we have our radio stack. So right where my mouse is there is COM 1. That is your VHF AM radio. Right below that is COM 2. That is your UHF AM, and I believe also FM in the UHF range radio. And then below that is the VHF FM radio, generally used for lower frequencies and sort of inter-flight communications. Over here we have some things related to IFF. IFF is identification friend or foe. Currently, for most things, IFF is not properly implemented in DCS, so these switches really don't do too much. Right here and right next to it, we have our throttle. As you can see, I'm moving it around here a little bit. Let me actually get active pause on. There we go. That's our throttle. That controls our engine RPM, obviously. Next to that, we have our, zoom in a little bit, we have our stability augmentation systems for yaw and pitch. These will generally be on. We have some switches over here relating to the fuel system, an additional fuel system. Actually, these are lights over here, excuse me. This is our fuel control. You got your boost pumps, you've got your refueling port. Right below that we have controls for engine startup and engine restart, as well as the APU, or auxiliary power unit. Looking up above that, on the first part of the front dash on the left-hand side, we have the landing gear handle. We also have the wing flaps gauge, tells us where they are. We have our landing gear position indicator lights. So in this case, we're sitting on the ground, so we have the typical 3 green, meaning the gear is extended. Whoops. Next to that, we have the downlock override. This is an emergency release for the gear, so if you were to lose hydraulic power or something along those lines, you could extend the gear. Right next to that, we have a series of 4 switches. These would be for master armament, gun armament, laser targeting pod, etc. Below that, we have a few more switches that relate to the onboard flight computers. Right above that, as you may have noticed, we have the left-hand MFCD, or multifunction color display. And we have one here, and we have one on the right, but more on the right later. The multifunction color displays, or just multifunction displays as most people will call them, are pretty much where you're going to do most of your work in this airplane. A lot of your instruments and a lot of your sensors will be displayed on these screens. So very important, very helpful, very useful. Next to that, we have the radar warning receiver. This is a signal strength based receiver, not a threat based receiver as in some aircraft. It gives us a readout of basically radar pings that we're getting from other aircraft or other ground targets that are emitting radar signals and that are scanning our aircraft. So we're picking up these radar signals, in this case coming from roughly our 3 o'clock. Right below that, we have the steam gauge airspeed indicator. Tells us our airspeed. Next to that, we have our ADI, so our attitude and directional indicator, also known as just an attitude indicator. Tells us our pitch angle, our roll angle. Pretty self-explanatory for aircraft. Right below that, we have our horizontal situation indicator, HSI. Gives us a sort of a compass readout of our heading. We can also set our course and get information such as ranging to waypoints, etc. Right next to that, off to the left, is our angle of attack indicator. This is not angle of attack in degrees, it's actually angle of attack in AOA units. And you'll have to forgive me, I don't actually know what the conversion is for the units here. But when we talk about some of the flight dynamics later on, I will go into a little bit about the angle of attack in a later video. Right above the ADI is the countermeasure jammer / missile warning system. So right now the jammer, JMR, is off. It's actually not equipped on the airplane right now. More on the jammer in a later video. Missile warning system active, also more on that later. And also our chaff and flare readouts for our countermeasure system. Next to that, we have our vertical speed indicator. This just basically, what it says on the tin, basically tells us how fast we are climbing or descending in the rate of thousands of feet per minute. Right below that is our altimeter. This tells us basically how high we are. You can set the altimeter pressure readout to whatever the atmospheric pressure is to get an accurate reading, or you can zero it out so that the big needle there points to 0, and it gives us what's called the QFE. More info on that later. Over here we have the right-hand side MFCD. Just like this one over here, displays a lot of information. A lot of different systems and sensors can be displayed here. Much more on both of these screens and the things that they can do in a later video. Right below that we have all of our engine management gauges. So we have things like our coolant temperature, oil temperature, our main fan speed percentage, our engine RPM percentage, fuel flow, more temperature gauges. We also have our APU percentage gauge, all things related to the engines and the power plant of this airplane. Right next to that, we have our fuel gauge. So we have 2 wing tanks in this airplane, as well as a fuselage tank. It is cross-fed, so all the fuel dumps out at roughly the same time. And we can see our left and right hand side each have their own gauge on their respective side of the gauge here. And we also have a totalizer. Let me zoom in on that there. Total pounds, currently right now there is 6,500 pounds of fuel on the airplane. Right below that we also have the fuel display selector. So internal fuel, main fuel, wing. There's no wing tanks. That is external wing tanks, external center, etc. Generally, I'll always just keep this on main, so that's not too much to worry about there. Below that is our actual countermeasure system. Now this is where things like your chaff and your flares and all of that will actually be programmed in, and you can have this in a automatic, semi-automatic, or manual modes. More on that in a, of course, future video. Right below that we have our annunciator panel. This right now is not showing anything, but if it were, and there is a problem with any system on the airplane, such as low fuel pressure or low oil pressure, low hydraulic pressure, things of that nature, you would get an indicator light here. Right next to that is our main electrical power panel. We have things like our APU generator, inverters, emergency floodlight, battery power, etc. Moving over here, right below the annunciator panel, this big old keypad and screen is referred to as the CDU, or Control Display Unit. This thing is so complex, I could spend 2 hours in a single video just talking about it. But for all intents and purposes, this is basically the flight management computer. It's essentially a full-on FMS for this airplane. Right next to that we have our oxygen regulator system. Usually just turn that on and you're good to go. Below that we've got some switches that control the CDU and the EGI, or EGI, which is an embedded GPS INS navigation system. There's just power switches there. And we have some various controls that sort of change as you can see what's going on there. Zoom out slightly. Right below that we have our TACAN, Tactical Air Navigation. So we can tune our TACAN channels. We have an ILS, Instrument Landing System, in this airplane. Can tune an ILS frequency there. We have a radio homing system that I don't really ever use that much, and I'm not really going to cover it in any of the videos because it doesn't seem to get that much use. Next to that we have our external lighting controls here, as well as internal lighting controls here. So things like our wingtip lights, as well as our interior cockpit lights. Above that we have our cabin air controls, canopy defog, things of that nature. Let's move back up to the front here. Above the front dash we have the HUD. Just recenter my track IR real quick so we can see it. So we have the HUD here. The HUD obviously displays a lot of our critical flight information, and I'll go in depth on the HUD in a later video. As well as we have the upfront controller, or UFC, which will get used quite a bit in later videos. That's really all I had for right now. Just giving you a quick tour of the cockpit, just sort of highlighting some of the buttons and switches, and I can guarantee you we will go in depth on all of this in numerous future videos. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and I hope to see you there. But for now, take care.